To tame the woman in front of him, Chris not only locked her away in the basement of his own house, but also secretly came down there every night to take advantage of her. All of his twisted and shameful actions were secretly witnessed by his son Brian, who even began skipping school just to return home and imitate his father's behavior. One weekend, a family gathering was taking place. Chris was a well-known local lawyer, standing above everyone and observing his family like a ruler watching over his kingdom. Peggy was his rebellious and independent daughter. Belle was his obedient and capable wife. There was his kind and innocent youngest daughter, and finally his violent and resentful son Brian. Every member of this family lived under Chris's absolute control. That night, Chris returned home and prepared to go hunting. As dawn broke over the silent mountains, he finally discovered a target that caught his attention: Anna, a wild woman who had survived deep in the wilderness as part of a cannibal tribe. She was washing her exposed body in the river, her dark skin covered with dirt and grime. She caught small fish with her bare hands and devoured them like a wild animal. When she stepped out of the water, her tall and graceful figure fascinated Chris even more. He watched her carefully, not with fear, but with the curiosity of someone observing a beast. Instead of being frightened by her wild nature, Chris developed an intense desire to conquer and control her. He immediately returned home. Chris was an extreme male chauvinist who saw himself as the unquestionable authority of the entire family. Without explaining his intentions, he ordered his wife, son, and daughters to follow him to the abandoned basement of their house and clean it up. The next day, Chris secretly followed Anna through the wilderness. After locating the cave where she lived, he hid nearby and waited patiently. When Anna left the cave to search for food, Chris saw his opportunity. He suddenly threw a net over her, catching her completely off guard. Anna panicked and struggled desperately, but Chris quickly rushed forward and struck her on the head with the back of his hunting rifle. Soon after, Chris dragged the unconscious Anna back to his basement. He chained her body tightly and secured her feet with metal wires to prevent her from escaping. Only after everything was prepared did Chris finally begin examining the woman in front of him. He noticed that Anna's entire body was covered in layers of dark dirt, carrying a strong scent of the wilderness. But when he looked closer at her face, he realized that beneath all that grime was a surprisingly beautiful woman with striking features. The only thing that caught his attention was her darkened teeth. Curious, Chris leaned closer to examine them. Suddenly, Anna bit down hard on his finger. Chris screamed in pain as Anna spat out the wedding ring that had been on his finger. Seeing this, Chris became furious. He slapped Anna violently across the face, but instead of showing fear, Anna glared back at him with hatred and defiance. Her reaction enraged Chris even more, and he continued attacking her until she eventually lost consciousness again. Only then did Chris leave the basement satisfied. Back in his room, he bandaged his injured finger and took several painkillers. Deep down, he knew that forcing someone as wild and untamed as Anna to submit would come at a cost. After the pain had eased slightly, Chris returned to the basement. He tried to convince Anna that he cared about her, telling her to stop resisting and accept her new life. But Anna would never willingly surrender. The hatred in her eyes was so intense that it seemed as if she wanted to tear Chris apart with her own hands. Realizing she still refused to obey, Chris decided to teach her a lesson. He pulled her chains tight, placed a wooden board beside her, and put on a pair of noise-blocking headphones. Then he raised his gun and fired directly beside Anna's head. The deafening gunshot shook the entire basement. The violent sound left Anna dizzy and overwhelmed. Unable to recover for a long time, Chris used the opportunity to threaten her, warning that if she continued resisting, he would fire again and make her suffer even more. With no other choice, Anna could only remain silent for the moment. Seeing that Anna had stopped fighting back, Chris decided to introduce her to the rest of his family. He brought everyone down into the basement. The moment they saw Anna chained up inside, the family members were completely shocked. His two daughters looked confused and disturbed, unable to understand why their father had done such a thing. Only Brian stared at Anna with unusual curiosity, unable to take his eyes away from her. Chris then revealed his true intention. He announced that Anna would be living with them from now on and that she would become his second wife. Belle, his current wife, was filled with anger and disbelief, but she didn't dare show it. Peggy also found the idea completely unacceptable, but Brian was different. He continued staring at Anna without blinking and even commented on how beautiful she was. Chris immediately ordered Belle to prepare food for Anna. With no choice, Belle turned around and left the basement to prepare the meal. Brian, however, remained standing there, still staring at Anna intensely. 1 hour later, Belle prepared a plate of food and brought it downstairs. Everyone was afraid that Anna would attack or bite them again. so Brian used a tool to slowly push the food toward her. However, Anna had spent her entire life eating raw fish and meat, and she had no interest in this kind of cooked food at all. Furious, she suddenly slammed her head forward and knocked the food over. It was obvious that Anna was a wild creature by nature, completely rejecting anything unfamiliar to her. Seeing that she still refused to submit, Chris decided to starve her for a few days, hoping hunger would eventually break her spirit and force her to obey. Before leaving, Chris warned his family that what happened in the basement must never be revealed to anyone outside. That night, the entire family sat together for dinner. Belle had no appetite at all. The thought of Anna becoming her husband's second wife filled her with unbearable sadness. Peggy also skipped dinner, overwhelmed by the same heavy and depressing emotions. Chris noticed his daughter's low spirits. After the meal, he went to Peggy's room, hoping to convince her to accept Anna's existence. After repeatedly pressuring and persuading her, Peggy finally had no choice but to compromise. Just then, Belle happened to walk past the room and accidentally overheard their conversation. Only at that moment did she finally realize the truth. She and Chris had been married for more than 10 years, but her husband had already lost interest in her long ago. Feeling completely defeated, Belle returned to the bedroom. After gathering all her courage, she finally opened her heart to Chris and begged him to let Anna go. She admitted that she simply could not accept living with another woman, but before Belle could finish speaking, Chris slapped her across the face and coldly told her that this was not something she had any right to interfere with. With tears and humiliation in her heart, Belle could only sit back on the edge of the bed and silently endure everything. Days passed one after another. Even while trapped in the basement, Anna never stopped fighting for her freedom. She kept pulling against the ropes, desperately trying to escape. But after countless struggles, she slowly became weaker and weaker. Looking at the piles of leftover food scattered on the floor, now rotten and spoiled, Anna had no choice but to crawl down and eat the scraps she had previously knocked over. After enduring another 2 days, Chris believed the time had finally come to tame her. He ordered Belle to prepare several buckets of hot water, planning to personally clean Anna's body and erase the last traces of her wild nature. After days of starvation and suffering, Anna was no longer as aggressive as before. Seeing this, Brian offered to help wash her, but Chris immediately refused. He ordered Brian to leave at once and shut the door behind him. Belle also volunteered to help, but Chris rejected her as well. He insisted on handling everything himself. Chris then put on a pair of gloves and began wiping away the layers of dirt that had covered Anna's body for years. But during the process, he quickly realized that the thick layer of grime could not be removed by hand alone. In order to completely clean her, the ruthless Chris resorted to an extreme method. He dragged Anna outside. The next moment, he aimed a high-pressure water hose directly at her. To remove the years of dirt covering Anna's body, Chris continuously blasted her with powerful streams of water. The intense pressure caused her unbearable pain, making her scream and struggle desperately. After several minutes of brutal washing, the dirt covering Anna's body was finally removed. Watching this cruel scene, Peggy could no longer stand by. Worried that Anna might die from the treatment, she immediately stepped forward and turned off the water. Anna silently remembered Peggy's kindness. After Chris's merciless attempt to break her down, the once wild and untamed Anna finally surrendered. She was forced to accept all of Chris's demands. Chris had finally achieved his goal of taming Anna. He brought her back to the basement and ordered Belle to dry her body and prepare clean, beautiful clothes for her. Seeing that his wife had cooperated throughout the entire process, Chris was extremely satisfied. He knew his plan had succeeded. As time passed, Anna's wild nature gradually faded, and she slowly became calmer. Chris personally brought her food and fed her bite by bite. After being starved for so long, Anna devoured everything in front of her and quickly finished an entire bowl of food. Chris once again expressed his feelings toward her and promised that as long as she stayed obedient and followed his rules, she could remain in this house and live a peaceful life. Exhausted both physically and mentally, Anna no longer had the strength to resist. She could only silently nod and accept. From that day on, Chris would secretly enter the basement every night. Belle knew exactly what her husband was doing, but she could only endure it in silence, afraid to say anything. What she didn't know was that every time Chris entered the basement, Brian would quietly follow behind him. Hidden outside the door, he secretly watched everything happening inside. Chris began removing Anna's clothes, and the entire dark and twisted scene was witnessed by Brian. The disturbing sight stirred something inside him, leaving him restless and consumed by a dangerous curiosity. The next day, while Chris was away at work, Brian secretly skipped school and returned home, hoping to imitate everything his father had done, wanting Anna to lower her guard. He first tried to win her over with cookies, but Anna showed no interest in them at all. After everything she had suffered at the hands of cruel men, she refused to let a younger boy humiliate her again. Determined to make Anna submit, Brian picked up a pair of pliers and attempted to force her into obedience through violence. But with her hands and feet tightly chained, Anna had no way to fight back. Soon, the basement was filled with violent noises and Anna's painful screams. Hearing something wrong, Peggy immediately rushed downstairs and opened the basement door. The horrific scene in front of her left her completely stunned. She angrily condemned her brother's actions and forced Brian out of the basement. Looking at Anna covered in injuries and suffering in silence, Peggy couldn't believe her own brother was capable of such cruelty. Fortunately, Anna's injuries were not life-threatening. She had only lost a few teeth, and Peggy quickly helped her fix her clothes and cover her wounds. Deep down, Anna understood that in this cold and twisted family, Peggy was the only person who had ever shown her kindness and treated her like a human being. Peggy then told Belle everything that had happened. Furious, Belle harshly scolded Brian and warned him never to step into the basement again. But just at that moment, Chris returned home from work. Belle immediately told him what had happened, expecting him to punish their son. However, Chris remained completely calm. He had already noticed Brian's obsession with Anna, and he even dismissed it as something insignificant. In his eyes, Brian was simply going through adolescence, and such thoughts and behavior were nothing unusual. Chris's cold and twisted attitude completely shattered Belle's last bit of hope. What shocked her even more was when Chris suggested that Brian could spend time with Anna in the future, telling Belle to stop overreacting and interfering. After years of silently enduring everything, Belle finally reached her breaking point. She gathered her courage and asked Chris for a divorce, determined to take her daughters away from this nightmare of a home.
I can't fucking do this anymore!
But Chris only laughed at the idea. He believed Belle, who had spent years as a housewife without working, would never survive on her own without him. Even so, Belle refused to back down. Her open defiance finally enraged the controlling Chris. He suddenly attacked her, brutally striking her twice and knocking her unconscious. When Peggy rushed forward to help her mother, Chris stopped her immediately and ordered her not to interfere. Terrified, Peggy could only stand aside helplessly. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Chris ordered Peggy to answer it while he and Brian carried Belle away and hid what had happened. The visitor was Peggy's teacher, Jane, who had come to check on her student's situation at home. Afraid that Jane would discover the horrifying secrets inside the house, Peggy kept talking and deliberately tried to delay her. Fortunately, Chris managed to hide Belle before Jane noticed anything unusual. Jane wanted to speak with Peggy's mother about her performance at school, but Chris quickly made an excuse, claiming Belle was exhausted and resting nearby. He insisted that he could handle everything himself. Jane didn't suspect anything and continued talking with Chris. During the conversation, Chris constantly praised Jane's intelligence and appearance, but his excessive compliments only made her feel increasingly uncomfortable. After briefly discussing Peggy's situation at school, Jane decided to leave. However, Chris refused to let her go and even shockingly invited her to stay the night. Realizing Jane was determined to leave, Chris finally revealed his true nature. He grabbed a rope, tied up her hands, and dragged her across the ground toward the yard. Peggy desperately begged him to stop and tried to intervene, but her efforts were completely useless. Chris coldly told her that from now on, Jane would no longer be her teacher, she would become her new stepmother. Unable to tolerate her father's madness any longer, Peggy finally confronted him and tried to stop his cruelty, but her resistance only enraged Chris further. He violently shoved his own daughter to the ground. He then dragged the tied-up Jane to the fence outside and locked her there. The loud struggle outside eventually woke Belle from her unconscious state. While Anna also heard the commotion from the basement, Peggy sat on the ground in despair, crying uncontrollably. Chris grabbed his daughter and forced her to accept his twisted reality. Faced with such a violent and controlling father, Peggy had no choice but to pretend to surrender. Soon after, Jane was dragged into the basement as well. Chris planned to use the same method he had used on Anna to break Jane's will. He locked her inside the room where he had once kept a wild dog. The animal inside became extremely agitated at the sight of a new victim, violently throwing itself against the cage. But after witnessing everything her father had done, Peggy finally stopped tolerating his cruelty. She secretly returned to her room, found the key to the chains, and unlocked every restraint keeping Anna trapped. Freed from captivity, Anna did not attack the kind-hearted Peggy. Meanwhile, Belle finally regained consciousness. Hearing screams coming from the basement, she slowly moved toward the source of the noise. But the moment Anna stepped outside, she came face to face with Belle. To Anna, Belle was no different from Chris. She had stayed silent, accepted his cruelty, and allowed countless innocent women to suffer. In Anna's eyes, someone who helped enable such evil did not deserve forgiveness. Consumed by rage, Anna attacked Belle and threw her body several meters away. Peggy witnessed her mother's death with horror and fear, unable to move. At the same time, Jane, trapped inside the dog cage, was desperately searching for a way to escape. But as she looked for shelter, another figure suddenly emerged from the darkness. It was another Anna. The woman who had been hiding inside the cage-like room suddenly attacked Jane, biting and tearing at her in a violent frenzy. Her screams echoed throughout the basement. It became clear that Chris's abuse and imprisonment of women had been happening for far longer than anyone knew. Meanwhile, Brian went outside to dispose of Jane's body, only to encounter Anna, who had finally escaped and returned for revenge. The father and son were instantly overwhelmed by fear. Chris hurriedly searched for a weapon to defend himself, while Brian stood frozen in terror. Anna struck first, killing Brian with a single blow. Chris tried to fight back, but in the next moment, Anna's weapon pierced straight through him. Finally, the cruel and controlling Chris, along with his equally corrupted son Brian, both met their end. After taking revenge, Anna walked out of the house. Then the other Anna hiding nearby slowly appeared. She was another victim of Chris's cruelty. He had imprisoned her inside the dog kennel for so long that she had gradually lost her humanity and began behaving like an animal. In the end, Anna had freed and transformed her into a companion.
Shit, he's got the keys.
Just as the two women prepared to return to the forest and disappear forever, the youngest daughter suddenly ran out of the house and walked straight toward Anna. Unlike everyone else, she showed no fear. Instead, she calmly handed Anna a bottle of water. Anna accepted it and drank deeply. Seeing the child's pure kindness, a rare warmth appeared in her eyes. She then gently placed her finger near the girl's mouth, allowing the child to understand her in her own way. Afterward, Anna gestured for Peggy to try as well, but Peggy, still filled with fear and uncertainty, slowly shook her head and refused. Anna did not force her. Instead, she held the little girl's hand and walked with her toward the deep forest, choosing to leave the cruel world behind and begin a new life away from suffering. Peggy could only stand there quietly, watching their figures disappear into the distance, silently praying that her sister would finally find kindness, safety, and freedom.